Gyo Jii felt the shift in the kitchen's humidity before he heard the clicking of Judy's designer heels. It wasn't the usual frantic energy of the dinner rush. It was a cold, high-status silence that didn't belong among the hanging pots and the smell of grease. Judy stood 5 feet away, her chin raised in a gesture of absolute dominance, while Marshal leaned against the stainless steel counter, his tailored suit a sharp, mocking contrast to the humble kitchen. Marshal's smile looked wrong. It was the look of a man who enjoyed watching others crawl. Gyo Jii's hands tightened around his kitchen towel, gripping it like an anchor to keep his suppressed power from erupting. He had worked 12 hours over a hot stove, his muscles screaming with a fatigue he had chosen for himself, yet he remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn, playing the role of the broken man they expected to see. The tension in the room was a wire pulled tight enough to snap until a different touch reached him. It was Sophie. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder, a single act of human connection that broke the emotional pressure and signaled a loyalty without knowledge. The humid air of the kitchen hung heavy with the scent of rendered fat and charred spices, a thick veil that usually offered Gyo Jii a strange kind of peace. He stood over a blackened skillet, the rhythmic hiss of searing meat serving as a steady pulse to ground his racing thoughts. In this world of steam and iron, he was just a man with a towel and a blade, his status and influence buried beneath a sweat-stained apron. But the sanctuary of his labor was shattered when the heavy swinging doors groaned open, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels announced Judy's arrival. She didn't belong in the humble, working-class environment of the kitchen. Her tailored clothing was a visual assault against the soot-streaked walls, her posture of dominance and emotional distance, instantly cooling the room's temperature. Behind her, Marshal trailed like a shadow, his expensive suit and contemplative yet cold expression mocking the very floor he walked on. "Still at it, Gyo Jii?" Judy's voice cut through the sound of the extraction fans, sharp and judgmental. She stopped just feet away, her crossed arms and raised chin signaling a superiority that made the junior prep cooks duck their heads in uncertainty. "I told Marshal we'd find you here, literally clutching your working man's tool like it was some kind of treasure." Gyo Jii didn't look up. He remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn. His head bowed as he flipped a cut of beef with practiced, deliberate restraint. His hands clutched the towel draped over his shoulder, his knuckles white not from the weight of the fabric but from the suppressed power he was choosing to endure. "He's dedicated, I'll give him that," Marshal drawled, his voice thick with a menace disguised as boredom. He reached out, his manicured fingers brushing a hanging pot with a look of pure evaluation. "But dedication without ambition is just a slow way to die, don't you think? He looks like a man who's settled for the steam because he's afraid of the sun." Judy let out a short, cold laugh that felt like a physical blow to the silence of the room. "It's not fear, Marshal, it's a lack of worth. He's comfortable in the grime because he doesn't believe he deserves the luxury I tried to give him." She stepped closer, her perfume clashing violently with the smell of wood smoke. "Look at you, Gyo Jii. You have the eyes of a servant. You've turned your life into a dead-end alley." The kitchen staff shifted, the packing of their work slowing into a claustrophobic stillness. They watched their leader, the man who taught them discipline and quiet strength, be reduced to invisible furniture by a woman who only saw his labor as a humiliation. Gyo Jii felt the pressure rising in his chest, a readiness for violence that he had spent years trying to erase. His brain, trained for emergencies, was already calculating the distance between his chef's knife and Marshal's throat. He was a dragon in a cage of his own making, and the bars were beginning to glow red. "Judy, that's enough," a soft voice broke through the menace. Sophie stepped into the foreground, her open posture, a sharp contrast to Judy's iron grip on the room's power geometry. She was a poor cashier, her own uniform worn and ordinary, but she stood with a calm and empathetic grace that Judy could never buy. He's doing his job, Sophie said, her voice a protection layer for Gyo Jii's dignity. The hands that feed people aren't stained. They're the most important hands in this city. Judy's expression shifted to one of pure, judgmental dominance. Know your place, Sophie. You're just the help. You don't get to evaluate real character here. Sophie didn't flinch. Instead, she did the only thing that could break the emotional tension. She walked over to Gyo Jii and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. It was the only act of human connection in the room, a loyal gesture that didn't care about status or influence. "Don't listen to them," she whispered, her loyalty without knowledge, giving Gyo Jii the anchor he needed to keep his suppressed power under control. "You're a man of labor and discipline. That's worth more than any tailored clothing." Gyo Jii felt the heat of her hand through his thin shirt, a warmth that countered the cool blues of Judy's emotional distance. He exhaled, his posture remaining upright but grounded once more. He wouldn't strike. Not yet. He would continue to endure for the sake of the only woman who treated him like a man when he was pretending to be nobody. "Fine," Judy snapped, turning on her heel with a calculated flick of her hair. "Stay in your steam, Gyo Jii. Marshal and I have a luxury dinner to attend. Try not to drown in the grease." As the doors swung shut, the isolation of the kitchen returned, but it was different now. Sophie's hand lingered for a second longer, a silent vow that she wouldn't let him be erased. Gyo Jii clutched his towel one last time, looking at the door with a cold expression that promised a shocking reason for his restraint. The dragon was still hiding, but the new rain was already beginning to simmer. The lunch rush had finally ebbed, leaving the kitchen in a state of exhausted stillness where the only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerators and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet. Gyo Jii retreated to the back alley, a narrow street of brick and shadow where the cool blues of the afternoon shade offered a brief respite from the steam. He sat on a discarded crate, his head bowed and his hands, stained with the day's labor, resting heavily on his knees. The humiliation of the morning's encounter with Judy still felt like a physical weight, a claustrophobic pressure that made his shoulders raise instinctively. The heavy metal door creaked open, and Sophie stepped out, her open posture and calm expression cutting through his isolation. She wasn't wearing tailored clothing or carrying the status of the people in the penthouse. She was just an ordinary worker in a faded uniform. In her hands, she carried a small plastic container and two mismatched forks. "The dragon is brooding again," she said softly, her voice a protection layer against the menace of his own thoughts. She sat on a crate beside him, the power geometry between them one of total equality. She opened the container to reveal a meager portion of rice and a few wilted greens, a working-class meal that stood in sharp contrast to the luxury Judy had flaunted. "It's not much," Sophie admitted, handing him a fork with an empathetic smile. "But my grandmother always said that a shared meal is a silent vow that you aren't alone in the world." Gyo Jii hesitated, his deliberate restraint making him wary of any human connection that might crack his disguise. But the warmth in her eyes was grounded and real. He took a bite, the simple flavors grounding his suppressed power better than any discipline ever could. "Why do you do it?" Sophie asked suddenly, her loyalty without knowledge making her bold. "Why do you let her talk to you like you're invisible furniture, like you don't have a reign of your own?" Gyo Jii clutched the towel he still had draped over his knee, his knuckles white. "Some people only see the labor, Sophie. They think the grime on a man's hands tells the whole story of his worth." Sophie turned to him, her posture leaning into his space, breaking the emotional tension. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder just as it had in the kitchen, a gesture of care without power. "They're looking at the apron, Gyo Jii. I'm looking at you," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet whisper of resolve. "You might be a chef in this alley, but you have the eyes of a king. There's a quiet strength in you, A dragon that's just waiting for the right moment to breathe fire. Gyo Jii felt a jolt of uncertainty and fear, not of an enemy, but of being truly seen. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the warmer tones of the setting sun. For a moment, the Mafia boss and the poor cashier were erased, leaving only two souls finding sanctuary in the moral gray zone of the city. A king without a kingdom is just a man with a lot of shattered dreams, Sophie, Gyo Jii replied, his voice a low hum of unspoken authority. Then we'll build a new one, she said firmly, her confidence acting as a fortress around them. One where loyalty is the only currency that matters. As they finished the meager meal, the symbolism was clear. The dragon was no longer just choosing to endure for himself. He was enduring for her. The new reign wasn't just about mafia justice or revenge anymore. It was about protecting the only person who had treated him like a man when he was nothing but steam and shadows. The following morning, the humble, working-class environment of the kitchen felt smaller, the air thicker with a claustrophobic tension that even the roar of the ventilation fans couldn't disperse. Gyo Jii moved through his labor and discipline with the deliberate precision of a machine, his head bowed as he prepped the line for the dinner service. He was a man rooted in the steam and shadows, yet his brain, trained for emergencies, remained hyper-aware of every sound beyond the swinging double doors. The shift in atmosphere was instant. It wasn't the usual frantic energy of a hungry crowd. It was the arrival of a predatory presence that demanded the room's absolute uncertainty. When the doors finally creaked open, they didn't swing. They were pushed wide with an unspoken authority that didn't belong to the staff. Marshal stepped into the kitchen, his tailored clothing an arrogant, high-contrast, visual assault against the grease-stained tiles. He didn't speak to Gyo Jii. He didn't even look at him. To Marshal, the man clutching a towel at the prep station was nothing more than invisible furniture, a tool of labor that came with the lease. Marshal walked a slow circuit of the room, his contemplative yet cold expression, evaluating the equipment as if he were already counting the price of the scrap metal. "This place smells of faded dreams and cheap oil, Judy," Marshal said, his voice a dangerously quiet drawl that echoed through the isolation of the kitchen. Judy stood by the door, her crossed arms and raised chin signaling her dominance and emotional distance. She watched Gyo Jii with a cold expression, her conditional love having long ago been replaced by judgment and superiority. "It's a dead end, Marshal, I told you. Some people are just born for the grime." Marshal stopped directly behind Gyo Jii, so close the scent of his expensive cologne overrode the smell of searing garlic. He reached out, his manicured hand hovering over a hanging pot, before he used a silver fountain pen to tap Gyo Jii's shoulder, not as a human connection, but as a man might tap a wall to see if it was load-bearing. "You," Marshal said, addressing Gyo Jii's back as if speaking to a servant who had forgotten his place. "Move the crates. I need to see the square footage of the walk-in. I'm thinking of erasing this entire wall for the new wine cellar." Gyo Jii's knuckles turned white around the handle of his knife. The suppressed power in his chest felt like a dragon trying to break the emotional tension with fire. He felt the humiliation like a physical blow, a pressure cooker of rage that demanded he turn around and show Marshal the lethal reality behind the chef in disguise. But then he felt a warmth in the foreground of his vision. Sophie was standing by the service window, her posture open and empathetic as she watched the power geometry of the room tilt toward cruelty. She didn't look at Marshal's status or Judy, tailored clothing. She looked at Gyo Jii. She saw the quiet strength in his upright and grounded frame, and for a second her eyes met his, offering a protection layer of care without power. "He's in the middle of a prep, Mr. Marshal," Sophie said, her voice calm but carrying a resolve that made Judy, chin raise even higher. "The labor he's doing is the only reason this restaurant still has a worth." Marshal let out a short, calculated laugh, finally turning his gaze to Sophie with a look of evaluation. The help is talking, Judy. How charmingly ordinary. He turned back to Gyo Jii, his smile looking wrong as he leaned in. Did you hear me, chef? Or has the steam finally rotted your brain? Move the crates. Now. Gyo Jii clutched the towel draped over his shoulder. His head bowed, even lower to hide the dark eyes that were currently calculating the price of Marshal's life. He was choosing to endure, anchoring himself in the discipline of his working-class role. With a deliberate, slow movement, Gyo Jii set down his knife and began to move the heavy wooden crates. He played the broken man, his posture signaling a humiliation that Marshal drank in like luxury wine. Judy watched the transformation with a contemplative yet cold expression. Her loyalty to the dragon, she once knew, completely erased by the sight of him performing menial labor for her new employer. "See," Judy said, her voice a cold hum of superiority as she watched Gyo Jii strain under the weight of the wood. "He knows he's invisible furniture, Marshal. He knows his worth is exactly what we tell him it is." Marshal watched Gyo Jii for a moment longer, a look of menace flicking across his neutral to cold face. "Good. Make sure he cleans the floor when he's done. I don't want the grime of his labor on my shoes the next time I come to reclaim my property." As the clicking of designer heels faded out of the kitchen, Gyo Jii dropped the crate with a heavy thud. The isolation of the room returned, but the emotional tension remained like a wire pulled tight. He clutched his towel one last time, his unspoken authority vibrating through his hands. Sophie walked over, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a loyal act of human connection. "They don't know," she whispered, her voice a silent vow of care. "They think you're a dog who doesn't know his place. But I see the king in those dark eyes, Gyo Jii." Gyo Jii looked at her, his resolve hardening into a readiness for the imminent war. The dragon was no longer just hiding. He was plotting a new reign that would erase the tailored shadow once and for all. The warmer tones of the apartment Gyo Jii shared with Judy felt claustrophobic that evening, the air heavy with a silence that was no longer a sanctuary, but a threat layer. He moved through the living space with the deliberate and quiet strength of a man who had spent his life navigating the moral gray zone. His head bowed as he performed the ordinary tasks of a domestic servant. Judy was out, likely attending another luxury gala with Marshal, leaving Gyo Jii alone in the isolation of their shared home to endure the role of the hidden Mafia boss. As he gathered a pile of Judy's discarded tailored clothing to prepare for the laundry, Gyo Jii entered the master bedroom. The room was a monument to status and influence, filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the cool blues of evening light filtering through the high-end curtains. It was here, near the foot of the bed, that he saw the symbolism of his humiliation made manifest. Lying on the plush carpet was a single gold cufflink, etched with a calculated crest that Gyo Jii recognized instantly. It belonged to Marshal. Gyo Jii clutched the towel he had been using to clean, his knuckles turning white as he knelt to pick up the jewelry. The cold weight of the gold in his palm was a physical blow to his resolve, a turning point where the conditional love Judy claimed to have for him was finally erased. The scent of betrayal was more pungent than the grease of the kitchen, filling the room with an emotional tension that felt like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. His brain, trained for emergencies, immediately catalogued the imminent necessity of violence. He could wait for her to return, drop the cufflink on the dresser, and show her the lethal reality of the dragon she had betrayed. He could break the emotional tension by burning the luxury life she had built on his labor. But then the memory of a gentle hand on his shoulder reached him through the menace of his rage. He thought of Sophie, her empathetic eyes, and the meager lunch they had shared in the narrow street of the alley. She was the only one who treated him like a man without needing to see the status of a king. To strike now would erase the disguise he had fought so hard to maintain for her sake. Gyo Jii's posture remained upright and grounded as he closed his fingers around the gold, He chose to endure the humiliation for a little while longer. With calculated calm, he slipped the cufflink into the pocket of his chef's trousers, his unspoken authority vibrating through his frame. He would remain physically present but emotionally withdrawn, a silent shadow in the home of the woman who viewed him as invisible furniture. When Judy finally returned hours later, her posture was one of dominance and emotional distance, her raised chin signaling the superiority she felt after an evening with Marshal. She didn't look at Gyo Jii as she kicked off her heels, treating him with the contemplative yet cold expression of a master evaluating a servant. "The dinner was opulence itself, Gyo Jii," she said, her voice a cold hum that mocked his working-class existence. "Marshal actually knows how to treat a woman of my worth. You should try to learn from him if you weren't so rooted in the grime." Gyo Jii didn't answer. He simply clutched his towel, his dark eyes reflecting the cool blues of the night as he watched her move through the room. The scent of betrayal clung to her like a second skin, but he remained a dragon in a cage of silence. "Is something wrong?" Judy asked, pausing to look at him with a flick of uncertainty. "No," Gyo Jii replied, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of resolve. "I was just thinking about the price of luxury, Judy. It's often higher than people realize." He walked out of the room, the gold cufflink a weighted secret in his pocket. The new reign was no longer just a plot. It was a readiness that was imminent. He would wait for the humiliation gala, and when the time was right, he would erase the tailored shadow and the woman who had traded loyalty for a price. The opulence of the penthouse was a cold, gleaming cage, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a status and influence view of the city that felt more like a moral gray zone than a sanctuary. Gyo Jii moved through the crowded gala with a deliberate and quiet strength. Yet he was dressed in the ordinary white tunic of a service chef, his posture signaling a humiliation that the wealthy guests drank in like vintage wine. Judy had orchestrated this humiliation gala with calculated precision, forcing him to exit the sanctuary of his kitchen to serve the very man who was erasing his dignity. He carried a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, his hands clutching the edge with a suppressed power that made the metal groan ever so slightly. Every step through the luxury environment was a physical blow to his resolve, a pressure cooker of rage that he anchored with the discipline of a man who had chosen to endure. "Ah, the chef has arrived," Marshal's voice cut through the emotional tension of the room, sharp and mocking. He stood at the center of a circle of elites, his tailored clothing and raised chin embodying a dominance that made the air feel claustrophobic. Beside him, Judy leaned in with a contemplative yet cold expression, her conditional love fully erased by the status of the man at her side. Marshal reached out not for a snack but to grab Gyo Jii's wrist, pulling his hand into the warmer tones of the chandelier light. "Look at these stained hands, everyone," Marshal drawled, his smile looking wrong as he displayed Gyo Jii's calloused, labor-worn fingers to the group. "This is the grime of a man who has no ambition. He spends his life in the steam while we own the sun." The guests let out a calculated ripple of laughter, their evaluation of Gyo Jii reducing him to invisible furniture in his own city. Judy didn't look away. She met Gyo Jii's dark eyes with a superiority that signaled he was nothing more than a servant to her new life. "It's a shame, really," Judy added, her voice a cold hum of judgment. "He has the eyes of someone who could have been a king, but he chose the labor of a dog. Don't let the grease touch the silk, Gyo Jii. It's worth more than your life." Gyo Jii remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn, his head bowed to hide the lethal readiness that was beginning to vibrate through his frame. The gold cufflink was still a weighted secret in his pocket, a symbolism of the betrayal he was choosing to endure until the dragon was ready to strike. The emotional tension was a wire pulled tight enough to snap, until he saw a flicker of humanity in the foreground. Sophie was there, working the coat check near the entrance. Her posture was open and empathetic, her dark eyes reflecting a loyal pain as she watched the humiliation from the shadows. She didn't see a servant with stained hands. She saw the quiet strength of the man who had shared his meager lunch with her. When Gyo Jii eventually passed her to return to the kitchen, Sophie reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder for a split second. It was a silent vow of care without power, a human connection that erased the menace of the crowd. "The stains on your hands will wash off, Gyo Jii," she whispered, her voice a protection layer against the humiliation. "But the stains on their souls are permanent. You are still the only man in this room." Gyo Jii clutched his towel as he stepped back into the shadows of the service hallway, his resolve hardening into a calculated readiness. The gala was a turning point. The tailored shadow had pushed the dragon too far, and the price of their luxury was about to become imminent. The humiliation gala had bled into the late-night hours, leaving the air in the restaurant thick with the scent of expensive scotch and the cool blues of cigarette smoke drifting under the warm-lit chandeliers. Gyo Jii moved through the service floor with deliberate and quiet strength. His head bowed as he cleared shattered glass from the wet pavement of a spilled drink. He remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn, a silent shadow in a world of status and influence that viewed his labor as invisible. The emotional tension in the room shifted when a drunk associate of Marshal's, a man whose tailored clothing couldn't hide his lack of discipline, lurched toward the service station. He looked at Gyo Jii, who was kneeling to sweep up the shards, and saw only invisible furniture to be toyed with. "Hey, chef," the man slurred, his smile looking wrong as he kicked Gyo Jii's working man's tool, the dustpan, out of his grip. "Marshal said you were a dog without ambition. Prove it, bark for us." Gyo Jii's knuckles turned white as he clutched the towel on his shoulder. The suppressed power of the dragon surged in his chest, a readiness for violence that felt imminent. His brain, trained for emergencies, had already identified the man's jugular as a turning point for the evening. He was choosing to endure, but the cage was cracking. "Leave him alone," a voice calm but vibrating with resolve cut through the menace. Sophie stepped forward, her posture open and unafraid. She was a poor cashier, an ordinary worker whose worth was disregarded by the elites in the room, yet she stood between the drunk man and the hidden mafia boss like a fortress. "He's doing more labor in 1 hour than you've done in your whole life," Sophie said, her dark eyes flashing with a loyalty without knowledge. "He's a man of labor and discipline, and you're just a coward with a glass." The drunk man's face twisted into a neutral to cold expression of superiority. "You're just the help, girl. Don't evaluate real character when you don't even have a status of your own." He raised his hand, the threat layer of the room reaching a simmering point as he prepared to strike her for her defiance. Gyo Jii began to rise, his unspoken authority finally ready to erase the disguise to protect her. But before he could move, Sophie did something that broke the emotional tension in a way he never expected. She didn't flinch or run. She simply turned her back on the threat and placed her hand gently on Gyo Jii's shoulder. The act of human connection was like an anchor in a storm. Her touch was a protection layer that didn't use force, but care without power. "Don't let him turn you into what they think you are," she whispered, her voice a dangerously quiet hum of empathy. "You're worth more than their luxury. You're worth more than this war." Gyo Jii looked up at her, and for the first time, the mafia boss saw the only person in the city who was worth protecting. Judy's conditional love was based on status, but Sophie's loyalty was rooted in the man she saw beneath the grime. The drunk man, unsettled by the quiet strength radiating from the pair, muttered a calculated insult and stumbled back toward the luxury of Marshal's table. The isolation of the moment ended, but the transformation in Gyo Jii's heart was permanent. He clutched his towel one last time as he stood up, his posture now upright and grounded with a new resolve. He realized that a new reign built only on revenge was empty. It had to be built to protect the humanity he had found in the steam. Sophie was the anchor for his dragon, and the price of anyone hurting her would be the erasure of their entire world. The cool blues of the late-night city air felt like a threat layer against the skin as Gyo Jii stepped onto the back balcony of the restaurant. His posture remains upright and grounded despite the exhaustion of another brutal shift. He had been seeking a moment of isolation to process the human connection he had shared with Sophie, but the emotional tension of the night was not yet finished with him. Through the partially open French doors of the private VIP lounge, the scent of expensive cigars and the warmer tones of the indoor lighting spilled out, accompanied by the calculated laughter of the tailored shadow. Gyo Jii clutched the towel on his shoulder, his brain, trained for emergencies, instantly shifting into a mode of deliberate observation. He remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn, a shadow against the brickwork as he listened to the two people who viewed him as invisible furniture. "He actually thinks he's safe in that kitchen, Marshal," Judy's voice drifted out, a cold hum of judgment and superiority. "He has no ambition, no status, just that pathetic labor and discipline. He's so rooted in the grime that he can't see the dragon has been replaced by a dog." Marshal let out a calculated chuckle, the sound dripping with menace. "The paperwork is almost finalized, Judy. Once the property is sold and the new reign of my development project begins, we won't need a chef. We'll erase this entire block." "And Gyo Jii?" Judy asked, her raised chin audible in her tone of dominance. "Once the ink is dry, we'll throw him to the wolves," Marshal replied, his smile looking wrong even in the unseen distance. "I've already contacted a few of his old associates, the ones who think he's dead. Imagine their surprise when they find out their hidden Mafia boss is just a man with stained hands and no protection layer left." Judy's laughter was a physical blow to the silence of the night, a final erasure of any conditional love that had remained in Gyo Jii's memory. "He'll be so cornered, he won't even know which direction the strike is coming from. He spent so long choosing to endure that he's forgotten how to fight." Gyo Jii's knuckles turned white as he gripped the stone railing. The betrayal was no longer a scent or a weighted secret in his pocket. It was an imminent war. They weren't just taking his restaurant, they were plotting to turn his disguise into his execution. But as the emotional tension reached a simmering point, he thought of Sophie. He thought of her hand resting gently on his shoulder and her empathetic promise that he was still a man. If he fell to the wolves, she would be erased too, caught in the crossfire of Marshal's ruthless greed. The dragon inside him didn't roar, it became dangerously quiet. Gyo Jii clutched his towel one last time, his resolve hardening into a calculated readiness. He wouldn't wait to be cornered. The humiliation he had been choosing to endure was about to become the price of their luxury. He turned away from the door, his unspoken authority vibrating through the dark. He wasn't a dog who had forgotten how to fight. He was a king who had been waiting for a reason to reclaim his kingdom. As he walked back toward the steam of the kitchen, the new reign was no longer a dream. It was a resolve that would erase the tailored shadow and the woman who had traded loyalty for a price. The humble, working-class environment of the kitchen was no longer a sanctuary, but a pressure cooker of claustrophobic tension. Gyo Jii stood at the central prep station. His posture remains physically present but emotionally withdrawn. Yet his brain, trained for emergencies, was hypertuned to the menace vibrating through the swinging doors. The cool blues of the early evening were being choked out by the warmer tones of the restaurant's interior lighting, a visual signal that the moral gray zone of the workday was ending, and the threat layer was taking over. The emotional tension snapped when Marshal marched into the kitchen, his tailored clothing an arrogant stain against the grime of the workspace. Behind him, Judy followed with a contemplative yet cold expression, her crossed arms and raised chin signaling that a calculated humiliation was about to begin. Marshal didn't look at Gyo Jii. He went straight for the service counter where Sophie was finalizing the day's receipts. He slammed a hand onto the stainless steel, the sound echoing like a physical blow through the isolation of the room. "There's a discrepancy in the status of these ledger entries," Marshal barked, his smile looking wrong as he glared at Sophie. "A minor mistake, perhaps, but in my world, labor and discipline are non-negotiable. You're incompetent, girl." Sophie's posture remained open and empathetic, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "It was a system error, Mr. Marshal. I've already corrected." "I don't care about your excuses," Marshal cut her off, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of superiority. "Your invisible furniture here, and furniture that doesn't function, is erased. Consider yourself fired. Pack your things and get out before I have security treat you like the ordinary trash you are." Gyo Jii felt the suppressed power of the dragon surge in his chest, a readiness for violence that made the air feel imminent with danger. He clutched the towel draped over his shoulder, his grip so intense that his knuckles turned white against the fabric. This was the simmering point, the moment where choosing to endure became a betrayal of the only human connection he had left. "She didn't do anything wrong," Gyo Jii's voice broke through the menace, a low hum of unspoken authority that caused the room to go dangerously quiet. Marshal spun around, his neutral to cold expression turning into a look of pure judgment. "The chef is speaking. How charming. Did you forget your place, Gyo Jii? You're just a man with stained hands who works for me now." Judy let out a calculated laugh of superiority. "Let it go, Gyo Jii. She's nothing to us. She's just a poor cashier who's been protecting a dog who doesn't even know his own price." Sophie looked at Gyo Jii, her dark eyes reflecting a loyal fear, but she didn't run. She stepped toward him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder for a split second, a silent vow of care without power that broke the emotional tension just enough to stop him from erasing Marshal right then and there. "It's okay, Gyo Jii," she whispered, her voice a protection layer against his rage. "I don't need this job. I only needed to know that someone like you existed." Marshal's contemplative yet cold expression shifted into a look of predatory resolve. "Actually, I've changed my mind. She's not just fired. I'm going to make sure she never finds labor in this city again. I'll throw her to the wolves alongside you." Gyo Jii's posture shifted. He was no longer physically present but emotionally withdrawn. He was upright and grounded, the dragon finally starting to break the emotional tension of the disguise. The towel in his hand was no longer an anchor for restraint. It was a symbolism of a life he was about to reclaim. "You think you're evaluating me, Marshal," Gyo Jii said, his voice carrying the status and influence of a king. "But you've never even seen me. You've only seen what your conditional love allowed you to see." "Is that a threat, chef?" Marshal sneered, stepping into Gyo Jii's foreground with a calculated menace. "It's a resolve," Gyo Jii replied, his dark eyes locking onto Marshal's with a lethal readiness. The simmering point had been reached, and the new reign was no longer plotting. It was imminent. The emotional tension in the kitchen reached a simmering point, as Marshal's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered menace. The warmer tones of the hanging lamp seemed to pulse with the rhythmic thrum of Gyo Jii's heartbeat, which had slowed into the deliberate and calculated tempo of a predator. Sophie stood her ground, her open posture still radiating empathy. But her dark eyes were wide with the realization that the moral gray zone of the restaurant was about to be erased by a storm. "You think your loyalty to this servant makes you special," Marshal sneered, stepping closer to Sophie until he was within her vulnerability layer. "You're nothing but invisible furniture that started to creak. I'm going to enjoy erasing you from this city's memory." Judy stood in the background, her crossed arms and raised chin signaling her dominance and emotional distance. She watched the power geometry shift with a contemplative yet cold expression, her conditional love for Gyo Jii having been completely replaced by the luxury Marshal promised. "Just finish it, Marshal. He doesn't have the ambition to stop you. He's just a man with stained hands and a bowed head." Marshal let out a short, calculated laugh and raised his hand, his fingers curling into a threat layer meant to strike the empathy right off Sophie's face. The packing of the room froze. In that heartbeat, Gyo Jii dropped the towel he had clutched as an anchor for months. He was no longer physically present but emotionally withdrawn. With a movement that defied motion blur and radiated a quiet strength that didn't belong to a poor chef, he stepped forward. Gyo Jii caught Marshal's wrist midair. The sound of the impact was a physical blow to the silence of the kitchen. Marshal's eyes widened, his smile looking wrong as he tried to pull away, only to find himself anchored by a lethal resolve. Gyo Jii's grip was like iron, a suppressed power finally finding its turning point. "You've spent so long evaluating the grime on my hands," Gyo Jii said, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of unspoken authority that chilled the humid air of the room. "But you never looked at the dragon that was holding them back." Marshal's posture broke, his superiority erased by a sudden frantic fear. What are you? Let go of me." "I'm the man who chosen to endure your humiliation, because I wanted to see if anyone in this city was worth my protection layer," Gyo Jii replied, his dark eyes locking onto Marshal's with a readiness that promised a shocking reason for his restraint. He glanced at Sophie, whose hand was still hovering near his shoulder in a loyal act of human connection. "She treated me like a man when I was nobody. You treated me like trash when you thought I was weak." Judy, neutral to cold expression shattered into uncertainty. "Gyo Jii, what are you doing? This is luxury you're throwing away." "This isn't luxury, Judy," Gyo Jii said, his unspoken authority filling the claustrophobic space. "This is a dead end, and you're the first one who's going to find out the price of disloyalty." With a deliberate and calculated twist, Gyo Jii forced Marshal to his knees. The power geometry of the kitchen had been permanently reclaimed. The dragon had finally awakened, and the new reign was no longer simmering. It was imminent. Sophie looked at Gyo Jii, her empathetic gaze now mixed with a loyal awe. She saw the king she had always suspected was there, and as Gyo Jii clutched the towel one last time before discarding it forever, he knew that the war had just begun, but he was no longer fighting it alone. The humble, working-class environment of the kitchen was suddenly pierced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of multiple high-end car doors slamming in perfect, calculated unison outside the alley entrance. The steam that usually provided Gyo Jii a sanctuary now felt like the stage smoke for a new reign, as the cool blues of the evening were pushed back by the blinding high beams of a fleet of black sedans. Marshal, still pinned to the grime-streaked floor by Gyo Jii's iron grip, let out a frantic gasp of uncertainty, his superiority completely erased by the sudden menace gathering at the door. The heavy double doors of the kitchen didn't just open. They were held wide by men in tailored clothing that possessed a status and influence far more lethal than anything Marshal had ever worn. A dozen men in sharp black suits filed in, their neutral to cold expressions creating a protection layer that transformed the isolation of the kitchen into a fortified headquarters. They didn't look at the luxury of the restaurant or the conditional love radiating from a panicked Judy. Their eyes were locked onto the man in the grease-stained apron. In a single, deliberate motion, the men bowed their heads. "Master Gyo Jii," they spoke in a dangerously quiet chorus of unspoken authority that shattered the disguise forever. Judy, raised chin dropped as her posture collapsed into fear. Her contemplative yet cold expression, now a mask of pure uncertainty. She watched as the man she had treated as invisible furniture finally stood upright and grounded, his dark eyes reflecting a resolve that made the room's power geometry tilt toward his absolute reign. Gyo Jii reached for the ties of his apron, his hands, no longer just stained hands of labor, moving with a quiet strength that commanded the foreground. He pulled the knot loose and let the fabric fall to the wet pavement of the kitchen floor, a symbolism of the humiliation he was no longer choosing to endure. Beneath the apron, he wore a simple black shirt that clung to a frame built for Mafia justice. The dragon finally fully awakened in the light. You really are him," Marshal stammered, his smile looking wrong as he crawled away from the unspoken authority vibrating through the room. The boss of the hand group, the one who disappeared into the grime. Gyo Jii didn't bother to answer him. Instead, he turned to Sophie, who was watching the transformation with a loyal awe. Her hand was still raised, as if to reach for his shoulder, but she hesitated, the status of the king now fully visible. Gyo Jii stepped toward her, breaking the emotional tension of the menace surrounding them. "I told you the price of luxury was higher than they realized, Sophie," Gyo Jii said, his voice a low hum of empathy that remained grounded only for her. He reached out and took her hand, his quiet strength acting as a sanctuary. "You treated me like a man when I was nobody. Now you will see what it means to stand beside the man who owns the sun." He looked back at Judy, who was attempting to break the emotional tension by moving toward him with a calculated look of conditional love. "Gyo Jii, I didn't know. I can help you reclaim everything." "You already helped me, Judy," Gyo Jii replied, his voice cold and dangerously quiet. "You showed me that loyalty can't be found in tailored clothing. You are erased from my new reign." He signaled to his men, and the power geometry of the room shifted again as they moved to throw to the wolves, the two people who had mocked the dragon in the steam. Gyo Jii led Sophie toward the black motorcade waiting in the alley, his posture now that of a king who had found a reason to fight. The reveal was complete, and as they drove away from the humble kitchen, the new reign was no longer a plot. It was a reality that would erase the tailored shadow forever. The cool blues of the hand group's high-rise headquarters offered a sharp, clinical contrast to the steam and shadows of the kitchen Gyo Jii had occupied only hours before. He stood at the center of a glass-walled command center, no longer clutching a towel, but draped in a status and influence charcoal suit that fit his upright and grounded frame like a second skin. Beside him, Sophie stood in the foreground, her open posture, a mix of awe and loyal curiosity as she watched the dragon operate with surgical precision. Gyo Jii's brain, trained for emergencies, moved through the digital landscape with a calculated menace. He didn't need Mafia justice through violence. Today, his unspoken authority would be wielded through the price of numbers. He looked at the rows of monitors displaying Marshal's luxury development projects and status holdings, his dark eyes reflecting a lethal readiness. "He thought he could reclaim my restaurant to build a wine cellar," Gyo Jii said, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of resolve. "He didn't realize he was building his empire on a moral gray zone that I own." With a deliberate nod to his financial team, the dismantling began. It wasn't a physical blow, but a calculated erasure of Marshal's liquidity. Gyo Jii moved with quiet strength, calling in weighted debts and reclaiming shares that Marshal believed were secure. Every keystroke was a turning point, a pressure cooker of market manipulation that forced Marshal's companies into a simmering point of total collapse. Sophie watched as the power geometry of the city shifted in real time. She saw the names of the luxury towers Marshal had flaunted turn from warmer tones of profit to the cool blues of bankruptcy. "You're taking everything from him," she whispered, her voice a protection layer of wonder. "I'm not taking everything, Sophie," Gyo Jii replied, his posture remaining neutral to cold as he watched a status stock ticker plummet. "I'm simply showing him the price of treating people like invisible furniture." His worth was always conditional on my silence. By mid-afternoon, the tailored shadow had been erased. News alerts began to flash across the screens. Marshal's flagship projects were being cornered by creditors, and his personal luxury assets were being seized. The man who had mocked Gyo Jii's stained hands was now the one with no protection layer left to hide behind. Gyo Jii turned away from the monitors, his resolve satisfied but his empathy reserved only for the woman who had treated him like a man. He saw Judy on a secondary screen, her contemplative yet cold expression, now a mask of frantic fear, as she realized the luxury she had traded loyalty for was shattered. "She's calling," an aide said, holding out a phone. Gyo Jii didn't reach for it. He clutched the towel of his new reality, the status and influence he had reclaimed, and looked at Sophie. "Tell her the chef is busy building a new reign where disloyalty is the only thing that's truly invisible." The isolation of Marshal's world was now absolute. Gyo Jii led Sophie toward the private elevator, his unspoken authority vibrating through the building. The tower had been dismantled, not with a roar but with a calculated, quiet strength that proved the dragon was most dangerous when he was plotting in the dark. The luxury that Judy had once used as a weapon was now nothing more than a shattered ruin. She stood in the lobby of the hand group, her tailored clothing looking wrinkled and ordinary, as she waited for the man she had once treated as invisible furniture. The cool blues of the corporate steel surroundings seemed to mock her contemplative yet cold expression, which was now twisted with a frantic desperation. When the elevator doors finally slid open, revealing Gyo Jii in his status and influence suit, she rushed forward, her posture no longer one of dominance but of a begging subordinate. "Gyo Jii, please," she cried out, her voice a shaky, broken shadow of the superiority she once wielded. "I didn't know the full worth of what you were doing. I was cornered by Marshal's lies. I've always had a loyalty to you deep down." Gyo Jii stopped, his posture upright and grounded, looking at her with a neutral to cold expression that made the air feel arctic. He didn't reach for her, and he didn't offer a human connection. He simply watched her as she attempted to reclaim a conditional love that had already been erased. "You didn't have loyalty, Judy. You had an evaluation of my price," Gyo Jii said, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of resolve. "When you thought I was a man of labor and discipline in a humble kitchen, you saw me as trash. Now that you see the king, you want to be my queen." Judy reached out to touch his arm, but Gyo Jii stepped back, a deliberate movement that reinforced the emotional distance between them. "I can change. I'll be the protection layer you need in this moral gray zone," she pleaded, her raised chin now a bowed head of humiliation. Gyo Jii looked past her to where Sophie stood in the foreground, her open posture and calm expression providing the only sanctuary he cared for. He thought of the meager lunch and the hand gently on his shoulder when he was nobody, and then he looked back at Judy's calculated tears. "Your love was conditional on the tailored clothing I wear," Gyo Jii said, his unspoken authority vibrating through the lobby. "But her loyalty was grounded in the man who clutched a towel. You aren't worth the steam from my kitchen, Judy." He turned away from her, his cold expression final and lethal in its isolation. He walked toward Sophie, choosing to endure her human connection instead of Judy's opulence. Judy was left standing alone in the cool blues of the lobby, erased from his new reign as he walked away without a second glance. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 13, The Price of Loyalty, where Gyo Jii's rivals attempt to test his new reign, and he has to show them the dragon is still lethal? The cool blues of the Han Group's executive floor were suddenly stained by a menace that Gyo Jii had anticipated since the moment he shed his disguise. The emotional tension in the boardroom was a wire pulled tight enough to snap, as 4 of his most senior lieutenants sat with contemplative yet cold expressions. Their posture, no longer one of loyalty, but of predatory evaluation. They looked at Gyo Jii, no longer clutching a towel, but seated at the head of the mahogany table, and saw a man they believed had gone soft in the steam of a humble kitchen. "You spent months playing servant to a woman who mocked you, Gyo Jii," the eldest rival Park began, his voice a dangerously quiet hum of superiority. "You've traded the dragon's fire for empathy and human connection. The hand group cannot be led by a man who finds sanctuary in a poor cashier's gaze." Gyo Jii remained physically present but emotionally withdrawn, his dark eyes reflecting the neutral to cold stillness of a dragon waiting for the turning point. He didn't defend his labor or his discipline. He simply watched the power geometry of the room shift as the men began to reclaim the authority they thought he had erased. "The coup was imminent the second you brought that girl into this building," another rival sneered, gesturing toward the door where Sophie stood in the foreground, her open posture, a mix of fear and resolve as she acted as his only protection layer. "You've forgotten the price of our world. You've forgotten that loyalty is bought with lethal fear, not care without power." Gyo Jii finally stood, his posture upright and grounded, radiating an unspoken authority that caused the packing of the rivals' heartbeats to falter. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a calculated digital tablet, his brain trained for emergencies, already executing a surgical precision strike. "You think I went soft because I chosen to endure the humiliation of the kitchen," Gyo Jii said, his voice cold and dangerously quiet. "But the kitchen taught me discipline that you've lost in your luxury. It taught me that a man is defined by what he can endure, not what he can flaunt." With a deliberate flick of his finger, Gyo Jii erased their status and influence. The monitors on the walls flared to life, displaying the shattered wreckage of the rivals' private side businesses schemes they had built in the moral gray zone, while they thought Gyo Jii was invisible furniture. He hadn't just been plotting his return. He had been plotting their erasure from the steam of his prep station. "I knew about the betrayal before I even left the alley," Gyo Jii continued, his dark eyes locking onto Park with a readiness that promised a shocking reason for his restraint. "I let you believe I was weak, so you would show me exactly where to strike with surgical precision. You didn't corner the dragon, you walked into his cage." The superiority on their faces turned into frantic uncertainty. They realized that the hidden Mafia boss hadn't been hiding from his enemies. He had been evaluating them from the foreground of their own greed. Gyo Jii walked over to Sophie, breaking the emotional tension of the menace in the room. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. The same act of human connection. She had used to save him in the kitchen, but now it was a silent vow of Mafia justice. "She treated me like a man when I had nothing," Gyo Jii said, turning back to his broken rivals with a lethal resolve. "You treated me like trash when you thought I had lost my price. The new reign begins today, and it starts by erasing the disloyal." He signaled to his loyal security team, and the power geometry of the hand group was reclaimed with surgical precision. As the rivals were led away into isolation, Gyo Jii stood with Sophie, his posture no longer bowed but upright. A king who had proven that the dragon was most dangerous when he had something, and someone to protect. A week later, the warmer tones of the small kitchen felt different, the claustrophobic heat of the stoves replaced by a tranquil and grounded hum of labor and discipline. Gyo Jii arrived not in a black motorcade, but on foot, his posture upright and grounded as he navigated the narrow street of the alleyway one last time. He was dressed simply, his status and influence hidden once again, though his unspoken authority radiated through the quiet space as he pushed open the heavy service door. Inside, Sophie was already at work, her open posture and calm expression, a sanctuary amidst the steam. She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting a loyal relief that erased the isolation of the past few days. She didn't see the Mafia boss who had dismantled an empire with surgical precision. She saw the man who had shared his meager lunch and clutched a towel to keep his soul intact. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a protection layer of empathy. Gyo Jii reached into his jacket and pulled out a weighted envelope, placing it on the stainless steel counter where he had once endured Judy's humiliation. "I didn't just come back to say goodbye, Sophie. I came to settle a debt of loyalty." Sophie opened the envelope to find the deed to the property, her name listed as the sole owner of the establishment that Marshal had tried to erase. Her hand moved instinctively toward his shoulder, the act of human connection that had been his only anchor during his disguise. "Gyo Jii, I can't take this. This is luxury I never asked for," she said, her resolve flickering with uncertainty. "This isn't luxury, Sophie. This is worth," Gyo Jii replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a quiet strength. "You treated me like a man when the world saw me as invisible furniture. You were the only one who defended my labor when everyone else saw grime." He moved closer, breaking the emotional tension of the room with a dangerously quiet, human connection. "I have to lead the hand group. The new reign requires a dragon who understands the price of protection. But this place, this kitchen is where I found my humanity again because of you." Sophie placed her hand gently on his shoulder, her posture signaling a care without power that reclaimed his heart. "Then don't be a stranger to your own sanctuary," she said, her silent vow bringing a warmer tone to the isolation of his new life. Gyo Jii looked at the hanging pots and the working man's tools one last time, no longer choosing to endure, but choosing to protect. He walked toward the door, his head no longer bowed, knowing that while he ruled the cool blues of the city's heights, his soul would always find a home in the steam, where a poor cashier had given him back his name. The cool blues of the city skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hand group's penthouse, but Gyo Jii's gaze was fixed on the small, framed photo sitting on his mahogany desk, a grainy shot of a humble kitchen, where the light was always a warmer tone than the steel and glass of his new reign. He adjusted the sleeves of his tailored clothing, a suit that possessed a status and influence meant to strike lethal fear into his enemies, yet he felt most upright and grounded when he remembered the weight of the towel on his shoulder. The emotional tension of the underworld was a wire pulled tight enough to snap, but he had finally found a sanctuary that no coup or betrayal could erase. He stood physically present at the height of his power, no longer choosing to endure the humiliation of those who viewed him as invisible furniture. But the transformation in his heart was not born from revenge. It was born from the realization that loyalty was a currency far more weighted than the gold cufflink he had once kept as a secret. He looked at the door as it opened, and his dark eyes softened, the neutral to cold expression he wore for the world erased in an instant. Sophie entered the room, her posture remaining open and empathetic, a sharp contrast to the dominance and emotional distance that Judy had once brought into his life. She wasn't a poor cashier anymore, but she still carried the quiet strength and empathy that had been Gyo Jii's only protection layer when he was a nobody. She walked toward him, her unspoken authority rooted in care without power, and she didn't hesitate to break the emotional tension of his high-stakes day. "The dragon looks like he's plotting again," she said softly, her voice a low hum that served as his only human connection in a world of menace. Gyo Jii reached out his hand, once stained by the labor and discipline of the kitchen, now taking hers with a deliberate warmth. "I'm not plotting an erasure, Sophie. I'm realizing the price of everything I've reclaimed." He led her to the window, the power geometry of the city laid out beneath them like a moral gray zone he finally understood. Judy saw a servant in a dead end. Marshal saw a dog without ambition. They only loved the king, once he had a three-piece suit and a motorcade. He turned to face her, his posture no longer bowed but grounded in a truth that erased the isolation of his past. But you treated me like a man when I was just a chef with stained hands. You defended my worth when I was choosing to endure their humiliation for the sake of a quiet life. Sophie placed her hand gently on his shoulder, the same act of human connection that had been her silent vow in the steam and shadows. Because a man isn't his status, Gyo Jii. He's the discipline in his hands and the loyalty in his heart. I didn't need a reveal to know who you were. Gyo Jii finally found peace, realizing that the only person who had treated him like a man when he was nobody was the only one who deserved to stand beside him in his new reign. The dragon was no longer hiding or plotting. He was protecting the humanity he had found in a narrow street alleyway. As they stood together overlooking the cool blues of the horizon, the tailored shadow of his past was gone, replaced by a loyalty without knowledge that had become his greatest fortress. He was no longer just a mafia boss or a hidden chef. He was a man who had been seen, and in that human connection, his reign was finally complete.